You're listening to a Mamma Mia podcast.
Mamma Mia acknowledges the traditional owners of land and waters that this podcast is recorded on.
This episode contains the recounting of traumatic events. Listener discretion is advised.
Rustler Park sits high in the Chiricahua Mountains in southern Arizona. Campsites belonging to the park are scattered along a number of roads, sectioned off from the meadows to avoid damaging plants and fragile soils. Paths from these campgrounds lead into the Chiricahua Wilderness, a national forest full of ponderosa pine and swarming with wildlife. Large animals, like black bears, are often spotted there. In the early afternoon of Father's Day 2015, 3 members of the Castrejon family arrived and set up camp. Lydia and Eduardo Castrejon had driven up the mountain with their 44-year-old daughter, Jeanette. Eduardo made lunch for his family at around 4 p.m. But within only a few hours, Jeanette Castrejon would be missing. She would disappear in what seemed like a flash. And since that summer evening on the 18th of June 2015, Jeanette was never seen alive again. I'm Jessie Stevens, and this is True Crime Conversations, a Mamma Mia podcast exploring the world's most notorious crimes by speaking to the people who know the most about them. In today's episode, I'm speaking with journalist Atavia McHenry about the unsolved disappearance of Jeanette Castrejon. Let's begin with the day Jeanette Castrejon went missing. Can you talk us through what happened that day?
Sure. It was a Father's Day weekend, June 2015, and Jeanette had gone with her parents to kind of celebrate, and they were going to camp for a couple of days. The setting is the Chiricahua Mountains. It's a very remote location in southeast Arizona. So they were going to spend a couple of nights camping in the wilderness, and they drove all the way from New Mexico. It was quite a ways. And Jeanette's brother, Oscar, and his wife and kids, they were going to join them later that evening from New Mexico also. But the first people to arrive were Jeanette and her mother and her father. And they kind of settled into their campsite, and there wasn't too many other people there. I think there was maybe 2 or 3 other groups, but it was a large campsite. They found their spot. They settled in. Eventually, they made dinner. And after dinner is when Jeanette's mom said, I want to stretch my legs and I need to go to the bathroom. So she kind of picked the bathroom that was furthest away from the campsite. And also it was kind of along the way, there was a fee box where they were supposed to kind of hand in the envelope with their payment for the campsite. Jeanette and her mother walk towards the fee box. Jeanette, puts the envelope inside there. And then her mother continues just a tiny bit further towards the bathroom. But Jeanette does not want to go to the bathroom. So she says, I'm just going to walk back up to our campsite. And her mother she just says, okay, not a problem. She didn't think that there would be an issue with that. It was pretty straightforward. She proceeds to the bathroom while Jeanette walks back up the road. Her mother uses the bathroom. She says within 1 or 2 minutes, she was done. She got out. She expected to see Jeanette on the road back towards the RV, but in fact, she wasn't there at all. She got all the way to the RV, and there was no sign of Jeanette. And she even asked her husband, have you seen her? And he said, no, she's not here. I thought she was with you. So it was kind of confusing to them both because Jeanette's pace was so slow that normally she would have expected to catch up with her before they even made it back to the campsite.
So what kind of time frame are we talking? That's got to be maximum a few minutes, right? That she kind of disappeared?
Yes. Well, her mother, in the police reports, she says a minute. I think she says 1 to 2 minutes. She said she used the restroom really briefly. It wasn't even a real restroom with running water. It was just one of those I don't even know how you call those, but She was very quick in there. She didn't take her time. And she said that her traces would have been lost within 1 or 2 minutes unless her mother really underestimated the time that she was actually in the bathroom.
And how old was Jeanette?
She was 44, I believe.
And why were her parents concerned so quickly? As you say, it was potentially only a minute or two. Were there extenuating circumstances that meant Jeanette needed constant supervision?
Well, yes, Jeanette had special needs. She wasn't self-reliant. She couldn't take care of herself on a day-to-day basis, and she couldn't do simple tasks for herself. Her mother had to prepare food for her or help her in the shower or help her choose her clothes. It was kind of like caring for a young child. So anytime someone in her condition goes missing, it should be a concern right away. Also, she doesn't move very fast, like I said, so it was immediately strange that she wasn't anywhere to be seen.
What had Jeanette's life looked like up until that point?
So she had a very promising start to her life. She came from a good family. She had started studying computer sciences at university. She was really intelligent. She had a boyfriend that cared about her and he wanted to marry her. Everything was really looking up for her until, unfortunately, at the young age of just 17, she was in a really awful, tragic car accident that left her brain damaged. And from that point on, she was no longer able to take care of herself at all. So she lived the rest of her life with her parents, and her existence was basically her house and her family, her parents.
Can you describe a little bit more about the campground in this park? What did the area sort of look like? Was there, I'm imagining sort of like bushland or forest around it. Is that what it was like?
It's a remote campground, kind of in the middle of nowhere, really. So it's not very popular because it's so inaccessible. The traveling up this mountain is very difficult. In fact, it's a miracle that their RV made it up there because even with just a regular vehicle, it's difficult. Like, it's very bumpy. Once you do get up there, it's very pretty. There are wildflowers. It's not very thick brush, more like a pine forest, if you can picture that.
And is there much wildlife around? Are there any concerns about the terrain or anything surrounding that area that might be a danger?
In terms of danger, I mean, there are bears there. You don't see them very frequently, and, it's very rare for them to be hurting people. And also, there's mountain lions, the same thing. They're a rare sight, and they're not typically dangerous to people. They're kind of skittish. They stay away. Those would be the more dangerous predators. I mean, there's flash floods in some times of the year, but it wasn't raining at that time, or there was no flooding at that time. That's all I can think of in terms of hazards.
Once her parents realised that she was missing, and as you say, they were particularly concerned because of her abilities, what were the next steps? Did they notify the police? Did they kind of ask around the campground?
The first thing they did, because they knew that Jeanette had a tendency to walk away in the past. Sometimes Jeanette was frustrated with the fact that she couldn't be independent anymore, and she would try to walk out the door. And on a couple of occasions, she had done just that. She was usually not very far from the house, and the family was just able to find her, I think, each time. So what they did, they just tried looking for her on their own. They went in every direction. They walked. They drove the RV in either direction, that, one towards the feed box, at the exit of the campground, and the other on the opposite side up the mountain. There was no trace of her. They called out her name very loudly. So they were really just trying to get this done themselves. Later on, their other son, Oscar, got there, and he was enlisted immediately in an effort to search for her. And he walked even further because, of course, his parents were older. They couldn't really hike that far. He walked pretty far. He said he walked as far as he knew that Jeanette wouldn't have been able to walk further than that. So he was confident that she wasn't there. And then at that point, that's when he drove down the mountain to get some kind of cell service to be able to call for help. And I think that was about 9 p.m. And that would have been about 3 hours after Jeanette was last seen.
Had anyone else seen her around the campsite? Were there any other witnesses?
You see, that's the weird thing. There was 2 people camping. It was a man and his son. And they do remember seeing somebody that matches her description. But they were kind of the only people that said that they saw her. The other groups of campers don't remember seeing her. And there were 2 park rangers who also don't remember seeing her. I think they only recalled seeing a man and a woman that seemed to match more the description of Jeanette's parents. So that kind of raised a question with investigators as to, was she ever even there? And I know some other people were suspicious about that too.
When the police did arrive, or authorities arrived, was there any evidence that indicated where she might have gone?
No. So at first it was just search and rescue that arrived because it was just a person that was lost. So search and rescue arrived around, I think it was around midnight. So, already many hours after the last sighting of Jeanette. And they didn't find any evidence at all. There was no footprints that they could determine. The dogs couldn't track her scent. All the items that her family had for her that were still in the RV were contaminated. And, of course, no eyewitnesses, nobody who actually saw her, walking off in that time frame.
Was much said or made of the demeanour of her family? Were they frazzled and scared about the fact their daughter was missing?
Some search and rescue personnel were a bit perturbed by some of their attitudes, and they noted this in their reports. Some said that the father seemed unattached, indifferent almost. There's no way of knowing. Everybody kind of reacts differently to fear and shock, but that's what they noted. And, you can hear it also in the interviews I've conducted with the search and rescue coordinator. There's also certain cultural differences that need to be taken into consideration. I believe that Jeanette's mother was immediately just frantic, but that they believed that perhaps her father and brother were a little bit too level-headed. And we discussed this in the podcast also, but that was the subject of some controversy, yes.
What were some of the theories that the search crew or the police came up with about what had happened?
So as soon as a criminal investigation began the following day, the sheriff's department was involved. I think their main theories were either, most likely one, she wandered off and is lost. The second was that she might have been kidnapped for whatever reason, either for ransom or for other motives. And then the third was that there was a possibility that her family was actually involved and was lying.
Our neighborhood was suspicious of the family. Did they want to get rid of this girl?
The way the article was written, there was a lot of, I don't know, I wouldn't call it slanted writing, but it left open the possibility that the family had somehow had a big role in this disappearance.
Most people that I have talked to in this case will say this family's responsible for this because we can't come up with anything else.
And what did the family think had happened?
It seemed that they initially thought that she had been kidnapped by somebody. From those early interviews and recordings, it appears that that's what they thought at the time immediately, and some of them still do.
Do you think that suspicion regarding the family might have affected those early days in terms of looking for her, that maybe it threw some people off course and therefore they weren't able to look properly, or do you think it didn't make a difference?
I'm not sure that it even made a difference because it does seem that they searched for her pretty thoroughly. According to their reports, of course, it says that it was about a 5-mile radius. I'm not sure, maybe it did. It seemed like there was some miscommunication and some bad blood between the search and rescue crew and Jeanette's family, but not so much between the detectives and her family. But of course, it's the search and rescue that conducted the actual searches. So maybe it did. I'm not sure.
You're listening to True Crime Conversations with me, Jessie Stevens. I'm speaking with journalist Atavia McHenry about the unsolved disappearance of Jeanette Castrejon. Janet wasn't the first person to go missing from the campsite. There were other cases. What happened there?
Several decades before Jeanette disappeared, there was a man called Paul Fugate. He was a park ranger, in the Chiricahua Mountains. And he disappeared from a location. It was still within the Chiricahua Mountains, but not exactly Rustler Park. It was close by. And he went for a hike one day after his shift and never returned. He was never seen again, dead or alive. That's a very mysterious case that is still unresolved. The case was reopened recently, but it's still cold, unfortunately. That case has fascinated many people since, because it kind of falls into that disappearances from national parks and national forests that captivates a lot of people's interest. And it's a very mysterious one. Although, after looking into it and speaking to many of the people who are most knowledgeable on it, including Paul's ex-wife, I kind of have a pretty clear picture of what may have happened to Paul.
What do you think happened to him?
Well, it sounds like most of the people who know about this case tend to think that there was actually foul play involved here, and that Paul may have seen something that he wasn't supposed to be seeing. Potentially that had to do with the drug trade, and that he was eliminated because he had witnessed, some people perhaps selling or exchanging drugs.
And 3 months after Jeanette's disappearance, something else mysterious happened at the campsite. What was that?
Yeah, that's the thing. That is extremely, extremely bizarre, because that I know of, nobody else has ever gone missing from Rustler Park, this campground. However, just 3 months after she went missing, another person disappeared from the exact same place. Is it a coincidence? It's too bizarre of a coincidence, in my opinion. I'm not saying that they're related, but it is very strange, and it definitely, makes me wonder. So there was a man named Lawrence Cosden. He also just decided to go. It wasn't clear whether he was going for a day hike or if he was going to camp out there for a couple of days. It's also not clear whether he was supposed to meet a woman there or not. Lawrence Cosden was in his 60s. He lived alone. He was very much a loner, but he was a happy man. He had his cat with him camping, which is bizarre, but he apparently took his cat with him everywhere. He even wrote it in his camping slip. He wrote, "1 person plus cat."
Was he ever found? Were his remains ever found?
His remains were never found, no. He was healthy and he hiked and camped often, but he seemingly just vanished. And he left his cat inside the vehicle, inside his car, which most people have told me that he would put his cat in a backpack and hike with the cat, that he would never have left the cat behind. So that was also strange. Some people have said that maybe Lawrence was planning on committing suicide, but I spoke to his sister who told me that he was happy and that he had just purchased a brand new car and a whole new set of furniture for his house, and it just doesn't seem likely. His friends don't think that he was in a position where he would have wanted to end his life.
There's a bit of a phenomenon of people going missing from national parks in the US. What can you tell us about that more broadly?
I don't really think it's a phenomenon, because I think people disappear from just about everywhere. And because national parks and forests make up a large portion of the territory in the United States, it's just another place where people can disappear. So it's just a statistic. And there are a lot of hazardous situations in national parks. There's places where people can fall, get trapped, or there's, of course, wild animals. So there's certain hazards there. But some people really like to read into that. I chose to explore the topic a little bit in one of my episodes, but I don't really buy into any of those paranormal theories. And I'm sorry if I disappoint some people there.
Were there any suspects in the investigation into Jeanette's disappearance?
No, nobody was ever named. There was just 2 men that were questioned, 2 people outside of the family that were questioned. Investigators wanted to know what they were doing, where they were. They were eventually, quote unquote, cleared.
Were her remains ever found?
Yes. So it took 3 years for her remains to be found. Bizarrely, they were found pretty far away from where she was last seen. So it was 2018, and it was a field biologist that was working in an area called Long Park. Long Park was another campground that was about 1.5 miles away from Rustler Park, and it was even more remote and even less frequented. And this field biologist, Amanda Moores, was staying there to study a spotted owl. And when her dog, brought these remains to her attention. It was actually just her pet dog. He or she dropped a large bone onto her lap, and subsequently also a large braid of hair. So that's when she realized that it was a human and not an animal bone, because, there was a large braid of hair, and she realized that her dog had just found some human remains, which is bizarre because, all these trained dogs didn't find anything, but then someone's pet just falls upon these human remains. And there was also just other fragments there. It took about a year for them to be formally identified, and then it was determined that it was indeed Jeanette.
And that many years later, I can imagine that those remains couldn't tell people much. Did it tell them anything about how Jeanette may have died?
No, nothing like that at all. All that could tell was DNA, and she was indeed deceased. And the only clue was where, which was even more puzzling because, and this goes into what I believe may have happened to Jeanette. I went up to Rustler Park several times, and one of these times, after I found out that these remains were found at Long Park, I walked from Rustler Park to Long Park, and I took the trail that most likely Jeanette would have taken to get to that location. And it was pretty challenging because of the high altitude in that mountain. It's strenuous, and the entire trail is uphill, and the terrain is really bumpy and rough, and you really have to watch your step. I was kind of out of breath when I got up there, and based on how Jeanette walked, and she kind of shuffled her feet and, took little tiny steps and walked slowly, and she was half blind, I don't see how she could have walked up there by herself at all, honestly.
So after your investigation, you spoke to so many people and studied it over years. What do you think is the most compelling theory about what happened to her that day?
Well, statistics show us that, the most likely theory in a case like this is that the person just wandered off by themselves and that it was an accident. But personally, I think that's a little hard to believe. And the people who knew her best initially also agreed that they didn't think that she could have made it up there. So for those reasons, I tend to think that somebody drove her up there in a vehicle. Also because her scent was lost as she was walking in that direction, as if she had been picked up by a vehicle. And so it seems like somebody potentially, for unknown motives, drove her up to that location where she maybe passed away by herself, or somebody did something to her.
Lastly, I just wanted to ask what her parents and her broader family think all these years later. They obviously have some closure knowing that she did pass away, but have they come to terms at all with what they think happened to her?
Yes, I think that in the case of her father, Jeanette's father kind of changed his perspective a little bit. Initially, he was very suspicious of somebody, kidnapping his daughter. And then I believe he stated that he didn't think that Jeanette could have climbed up that mountain by herself or gone very far by herself. I mean, this was before he knew she was all the way up there. But he didn't think she could go very far. And neither could her siblings and her mother. But while her mother still believes that somebody harmed Jeanette or caused her to die in some way, perhaps kidnapped her, perhaps hurt her in some way, I believe her father changed his stance on this a little bit, where he now thinks that maybe Jeanette did climb up that mountain by herself.
It's such a mystery, as you say, as to what it could be, because there are so many things that don't add up, that I can see why you have the theory that someone drove her rather than her walking, knowing what her ability was.
Right, yeah. And some people may criticize me for this, but that's just my opinion. I could be wrong, but I was there and I spoke to many people and I hiked up that mountain, and I just don't see that happening.
Atavia McHenry is a journalist and podcaster with a focus on cold cases and missing person stories. She spent 2 years investigating and researching the disappearance of Jeanette Castrejon, interviewing members of law enforcement agencies, the families of the missing, as well as renowned crime analyst Laura Richards. If you want to hear her full investigation, you can find a link to her podcast, The Labyrinth, in our show notes. True Crime Conversations is a Mamma Mia podcast hosted by me, Jessie Stevens. Sound design is by Ian Camilleri, and our producer is Gia Moylan. If you've enjoyed today's episode or have a suggestion for a case you'd like us to cover, let us know. You can send an email to truecrime@mamamia.com.au, or you can join our True Crime Conversations Facebook page and tag us there. I'll be back next week with another episode, but in the meantime, if you'd like to hear more from me, you can find me on Mamma Mia Out Loud 3 times a week, as well as our new podcast, Cancelled, which follows the story of a celebrity's cancellation.